January 1945. High above the Pacific, the air is thin and bright, the kind of cold that seeps through oxygen masks and gloves. Far below, the ocean stretches without landmarks, a flat geometry of blue that offers no reference point, only distance. A formation of American bombers moves steadily west. They have been expected to turn back by now. Every previous raid has. Japanese interceptor units have done the calculations countless times before. Speed, altitude, fuel burn, interception arcs. Fighters wait where logic says the enemy must appear alone, but something is wrong. Silver specks remain beside the bombers, not stragglers, not damaged aircraft, fighters still there, still pacing the formation hour after hour. The Japanese pilots climb to meet them, already thinking about fuel gauges, already calculating how long they can stay. The Americans do not seem to be doing the same math. The encounter is brief, violent, and inconclusive. When it ends, the bombers continue on, the fighters stay with them. For the first time in the Pacific Air War, distance itself has stopped protecting the defender, and in that moment, an entire system of assumptions, built on geometry, fuel limits, and return paths, begins to collapse. To understand why this shocked Japanese pilots so deeply, we must step back into the strategic world that shaped their expectations. The geometry of distance in the Pacific War was never fought evenly on a map. From the first day, geography dictated everything. The distances between islands were measured not in miles, but in fuel burn. Bases were scattered across chains of coral and volcanic rock. Every aircraft sortie began with a calculation: how far out, how long over target, and, most critically, how far back. There were no safe emergency fields. The ocean did not forgive mistakes. For Japan, this reality shaped air doctrine long before the war began. The Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces were built around point defense and interception, not sustained escort or deep penetration. Fighters were designed to climb quickly, engage aggressively, and return before fuel ran dry. Range was sacrificed for maneuverability and rate of climb. The Zero, the Ki-43, and later the Ki-84 all reflected this philosophy in different ways. Early victories seemed to confirm the logic. In 1941 and 1942, Japanese pilots fought near friendly bases or carrier decks. Engagements were short. The enemy came, fought, and left. Survival depended on knowing when to disengage. Distance itself was a shield. American air power, by contrast, struggled under the same tyranny. Early U.S. fighters in the Pacific, like the P-40 and F-4F, were forced to operate close to their bases. Bomber formations often flew unescorted or only partially covered. Japanese interceptors waited for the moment escorts turned back. Then they attacked. This pattern repeated across the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific. Bombers without fighters suffered. Fighters without range were predictable. Interception geometry became routine. Japanese pilots learned to visualize invisible circles around enemy bases, the maximum radius an escort could cover. Once bombers crossed that boundary, they were alone. By 1943, this thinking was deeply ingrained. Japanese air defense planning revolved around expected turn, back points. Interceptor squadrons were timed to arrive just after escorts departed. Fuel reserves were calculated accordingly. Engagement windows were short and carefully managed. But the war was changing. American industry was accelerating. New airfields were being carved from jungle and coral. Strategic bombing doctrine was expanding beyond tactical support into sustained pressure. Yet even then, one problem persisted. Escort fighters still could not go far enough. The solution would not come from a new tactic alone, but from redefining the relationship between fuel, distance, and combat itself. And that shift began far from the Pacific, in a different theater of war. The arrival of an unseen assumption breaker, the aircraft that would disrupt Japanese air defense geometry, was not designed for the Pacific at all. The P-51 Mustang was born from a British requirement in 1940, Conceived as a fast, efficient fighter that could be built quickly, its early versions were impressive at low altitude but unremarkable at height. What made the airframe different was not firepower or agility, but efficiency. The Mustang's laminar flow wing reduced drag across long distances. Its fuselage was shaped for sustained cruise, not just combat bursts. Everything changed when the aircraft received the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, built in America as the Packard V1650. High-altitude performance transformed overnight, but range, the factor that would matter most in the Pacific, was still evolving. By late 1943, American planners had learned a brutal lesson from Europe and the Pacific alike. Bombers without escorts died. The solution was not just a better fighter, but a fighter that could stay. Drop tanks, refined fuel mixtures, and disciplined cruise profiles turned the Mustang into something unprecedented. A long-distance companion rather than a short-range guardian. The Pacific theater amplified this advantage. Island hopping brought new bases within reach, but still separated by vast stretches of ocean. From the Marianas, American bombers could reach the Japanese home islands. Previously, escort coverage would have ended far from the target. Japanese planners expected that gap. They built their defensive thinking around it. What they did not account for was how American logistics scaled. Fuel quality improved. External tanks became standard. Maintenance systems ensured Mustangs arrived at altitude with engines optimized for long cruise rather than short combat sprints. The fighter was no longer tied to a simple radius. It operated along a corridor. Japanese intelligence noticed the Mustang's appearance, but misunderstood its implications. Range figures were often estimated conservatively or based on earlier escort behavior. The assumption remained, fighters must turn back. By the time P-51 units began operating regularly in the Pacific in late 1944, Japanese interception doctrine was already brittle. It relied on fixed expectations, where escorts would appear, where they would disappear, and when bombers would be exposed. The Mustang did not simply extend that line, it erased it. And as theory met reality, the shock would be felt not in reports or maps, but in the cockpit, where pilots suddenly found the enemy still present when every calculation said they should be gone. That collision between expectation and experience is best understood by examining the problem from multiple angles. Human, tactical, and technological perspectives, the human angle waiting for the turn. Back Japanese fighter pilots did not think in abstractions. They thought in minutes. Every scramble was shadowed by the fuel clock. Interception training emphasized rapid climb, swift engagement, and disciplined withdrawal. Pilots memorized expected escort endurance the same way sailors memorized tides. The moment American fighters turned away had become a psychological landmark, proof that the battle space had narrowed again. When Mustangs failed to disengage, the stress was immediate. Pilots reported an unfamiliar pressure. The enemy was no longer racing a fuel gauge. Each additional minute in combat tightened the return margin. Confidence eroded not because the Mustang was unbeatable, but because it refused to leave. The tactical angle-broken interception geometry, Japanese air defense relied on predictable geometry. Interceptors launched from known bases climbed to intercept bombers at calculated altitudes, assuming escorts would peel away before reaching inner defensive rings. This allowed defenders to concentrate force at the most vulnerable moment. The P-51 collapsed that sequence. Escorts stayed with bombers deep into defended airspace, disrupting timing and dispersing interceptors. Attacks became fragmented. Instead of a single decisive engagement, Japanese pilots faced continuous skirmishing with escorts that dictated altitude, speed, and position. The geometry no longer closed, it elongated. The technological angle efficiency as a weapon, the Mustang's greatest threat, was invisible. Its laminar flow wing and high fuel fraction allowed sustained cruise at speeds where Japanese fighters bled fuel rapidly. Drop tanks extended endurance without sacrificing performance once jettisoned. Japanese fighters optimized for agility, paid for every climb and turn. Engines ran rich, fuel gauges fell. The Mustang could loiter, choose when to fight, and still have the range to return. Technology had shifted the burden of time onto the defender. These pressures did not exist in isolation. They fed into command decisions, intelligence failures, and moral strain. Angles that reveal how range became not just a tactical advantage, but a strategic shock. Leadership, intelligence, and psychological impact. The leadership angle planning around assumptions. Japanese air commanders planned defense in layers. Early warning, scramble timing, interception altitude, and disengagement windows were all calibrated to known enemy limits. Range was treated as a constant. Orders emphasized conserving pilots and aircraft by avoiding prolonged engagements. When Mustangs remained on station, leadership faced an impossible choice: commit more fighters and risk fuel starvation, or disengage and concede the airspace. Neither option fit existing doctrine. Commanders found themselves reacting rather than controlling, issuing fragmented orders as formations arrived late or encountered escorts earlier than expected. The intelligence angle seeing the plane, missing the meaning. Japanese intelligence identified the P-51 visually and in reports, but its operational significance was underestimated. Analysts focused on speed and armament, not endurance. Range was difficult to measure from encounters alone, especially when Mustangs did not always press attacks. This misreading delayed doctrinal adaptation. By the time the Mustang's escort persistence became undeniable, airframes and fuel supplies were already stretched thin. The psychological angle nowhere feels safe. Perhaps the most corrosive effect was mental. Previously, Japanese pilots knew there were zones where the enemy could not stay. Those zones vanished. Airfields, assembly points, and climb corridors were now exposed. The sky no longer reset between engagements. Pilots landed exhausted, knowing the enemy could return at any hour, from any direction, and stay as long as necessary. All of this pressure converged at a single moment, when Japanese defenders finally realized that the Mustang's range had not merely extended the fight, but redefined it entirely. That realization would come during sustained escort operations over Japan itself. When the calculations failed by late 1944, the last buffer of distance was gone. The capture of the Mariana Islands placed American air power within direct reach of the Japanese home islands. From bases on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, B-29 superfortresses began flying missions that no previous bomber force could sustain. Their altitude and speed already strained Japanese defenses. What mattered more was what flew beside them. At first, Japanese planners expected familiar limits to reassert themselves. Escort fighters would appear briefly, then vanish. Interceptors would wait, conserving fuel, timing their climbs for the moment the bombers stood alone. The geometry still seemed sound on paper. The first long-range Mustang escorts shattered that paper logic. P-51s did not merely escort to the edge of Japanese airspace. They crossed it. They remained overhead during bomb runs. They lingered during withdrawal. Some even strafed airfields before turning home. Japanese pilots scrambled, expecting a window that never opened. Fuel gauges began to dictate decisions faster than enemy gunfire. Interceptors climbed only to find Mustangs already positioned above them. Attacks dissolved into individual duels rather than coordinated strikes. Every maneuver burned fuel that could not be replaced. Reports filtered back to command centers describing the same phenomenon. Escorts still present well past expected turn. Back points. No single engagement seemed decisive. The shock lay in duration. The Americans controlled the clock. For Japanese pilots trained to fight within strict endurance envelopes, this was disorienting. Combat was no longer a brief, violent exchange followed by escape. It was a drawn-out contest of time, and time now favored the attacker. As missions repeated, the realization spread. This was not an anomaly. It was a new constant, and with that understanding came a deeper fear that the sky over Japan itself was no longer bounded by fuel or distance, but open to sustained pressure that could not be outrun. By early 1945, the pattern was undeniable. Mustang escorts no longer surprised Japanese pilots, they haunted them. P-51s appeared at altitudes where interception was costly, then stayed long enough to force defenders into impossible choices. Engage and risk not making it home, or disengage and abandon the bombers to their mission. Escort tactics evolved with confidence. Mustangs swept ahead of bomber streams, patrolling likely climb routes and airfields. They did not wait to be attacked. They denied space before the fight even began. Japanese fighters rose only to find the geometry already occupied. The mathematics of interception had inverted. Instead of defenders choosing the moment of contact, escorts dictated it. Instead of bombers passing briefly through defended airspace, they lingered under a moving umbrella of fighters that refused to retract. Japanese after-action reports increasingly described fuel exhaustion rather than combat losses as the limiting factor. Pilots broke off engagements not because they were defeated, but because they were running out of time. Some ditched at sea on return. Others landed short. The sky itself had become hostile. Perhaps most damaging was the realization that there was no adaptation left. Aircraft designs could not be altered quickly. Fuel shortages worsened. Training hours declined. Even perfect tactics could not overcome a fighter that did not have to leave. When American planners recognized this shift, they exploited it ruthlessly. Escort presence became continuous. The enemy was denied recovery periods. Pressure was sustained not through numbers alone, but through endurance. By spring, Japanese air defense had lost coherence, not from a single battle, but from accumulated impossibility. The decisive moment was not a dogfight or a shoot-down. It was the quiet understanding, spreading through squadrons and command staffs alike, that the air war's old boundaries no longer existed. And once boundaries vanish, consequences follow. The immediate consequences were measurable and unforgiving. Japanese fighter losses rose steadily through 1945, but the more telling figures lay beneath the surface. Sortie effectiveness declined, abort rates increased. Pilots returned with empty tanks and no victories to show for it. Aircraft were lost not only to enemy fire, but to fuel exhaustion, emergency landings, and accidents on overworked airfields. The P-51's range forced Japanese units into a state of permanent reaction. Scrambles were launched earlier and more often, burning precious fuel before contact was even made. Engines ran harder, longer, and with less margin for error. Maintenance crews struggled to keep pace as aircraft returned stressed and damaged. Most damaging was pilot fatigue. Continuous escort presence meant there were no predictable lulls. Airfields once considered rear areas were now under threat from strafing and patrols. Pilots slept lightly, if at all. Training flights were curtailed. Replacement pilots entered combat with fewer hours and less confidence. Strategically, the loss of interception windows crippled coordinated defense. Without a moment when bombers were unescorted, Japanese commanders could no longer mass fighters effectively. Engagements became scattered, reactive, and costly. American loss rates, by contrast, stabilized. Escorts absorbed the burden of combat, allowing bombers to focus on navigation and payload. Range translated directly into survivability. By mid-1945, it was clear that Japanese air defense was being eroded not by a single overwhelming blow, but by sustained pressure that could not be relieved. The sky offered no pause, and as material losses mounted, deeper structural consequences began to emerge. As the months passed, the consequences of lost range compounded into something irreversible. Japanese air doctrine, already strained by fuel shortages and industrial damage, could not adapt quickly enough. Plans that relied on selective engagement or sacrificial interception no longer matched reality. The enemy did not appear briefly and depart. It remained, watching, waiting, and striking at moments of its own choosing. Industrial centers, once protected by distance and limited escort coverage, were now exposed continuously. The psychological effect on civilians and workers was profound. Air raid alerts blurred into a constant background of threat. The sense that airspace could be defended eroded alongside physical infrastructure. For pilots and commanders alike, inevitability replaced uncertainty. Losses could be delayed, but not avoided. Fuel rationing tightened. Training programs shrank further. Aircraft sat grounded for lack of gasoline, while Mustangs continued to appear overhead, unchallenged. American planners understood the asymmetry they had created. Range allowed not just escort, but dominance. The P-51 did not need to destroy every Japanese fighter. It only needed to stay long enough to make resistance unsustainable. By the summer of 1945, Japanese air defense was fragmented and exhausted. The geometrical nightmare was complete. Every defensive calculation now ended the same way, with insufficient fuel, insufficient time, and an enemy that refused to withdraw. The collapse of aerial resistance did not end the war alone, but it stripped away one of Japan's last means of control over its own skies. And when the skies are lost, the meaning of warfare itself changes. That understanding lingers long after the engines fall silent. The P-51 Mustang did not win the Pacific Air War through speed alone, or firepower, or even numbers. It won by changing the shape of the sky. For decades, air combat had been governed by invisible borders, fuel limits, return paths, and expected turn-back points. These were not lines on maps, but shared assumptions. Japanese pilots trusted them. Commanders planned around them. Entire defensive systems rested on the belief that distance would eventually force the enemy to leave. The Mustang broke that belief. Its range transformed escort fighters from temporary companions into permanent presences. Geometry, once a defender's ally, became a trap. Every calculation ended with the same conclusion: the enemy would still be there. Time, not maneuver, became the deciding factor, and time now belonged to the attacker. This shift carried a quiet lesson about modern warfare. Superiority does not always arrive with a dramatic breakthrough. Sometimes it appears as endurance, an ability to remain when the opponent must withdraw. In those moments, resistance collapses not in flames, but in fatigue. For Japanese pilots, the nightmare was not the Mustang's guns. It was its refusal to turn back, and in that refusal lay a new truth of air power. When distance ceases to protect, the sky itself becomes contested ground, without edges, without refuge, and without escape.